Okay, welcome, folks. Thank you so much for coming out to our event this evening, which is Risk, Resilience, and Reconciliation, Building a Safe and Secure North. My name is Linda Harling-Stalker. I'm the director of the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government. Before we get started, I just want to start off by acknowledging that we're meeting today in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'd also like, as we're talking about the North, to recognize some of the First Nations and Inuit folks who live in the North, including the Inuit, Gwich'in, Innu, Dene, Tanhana, Northern Taishani, Southern Taishani, Han, Kikkert, Kaska, Tagish, Tagish. Please forgive my pronunciations. It's not something that I'm very well versed in, to my detriment. I also want to recognize that we remember, as we're talking about various other northern regions, including the Sami, who may be coming into our discussion as we're talking about U.S. relations in the North. I also want to recognize that we're here this month, and it's African Heritage Month here in Nova Scotia. So I want to thank the Africadians, the name that was developed by George Eliot Clark, for the contributions that they have done to build and sustain our province of Nova Scotia. So on that note, you won't be hearing much from me. I have the honor and pleasure of handing the mic over to this evening's moderator, Dr. Asa McKercher. Dr. McKercher is the Stephen K. Hudson Chair in Canada-U.S. Relations here in the Mulroney Institute, and he will be the one introducing and moderating our panel and taking your questions towards the end of the event. So please join me in welcoming Dr. McKercher.
Thank you, Dr. Stalker. I'll briefly introduce our panelists. They'll then give a statement or something like that, I guess. Then I'll ask a question of each of them, and then I'll turn it over, which is the most exciting part of the evening, to you. So farthest away from me is Dr. Peter Kikkert, Associate Professor of Public Policy and Governance here at St. FX and a Research Fellow at the Brian Mulroney Institute. We have Dr. Adam Lajeunesse, Associate Professor in Public Policy and Governance and the Mulroney Chair in Arctic and Maritime Security. And the Honourable, you're honorable to me. You'll always be honorable to me. The formerly honorable Sandy Silver, former Premier of Yukon, who holds the position of Dahdaleh Practitioner-in-Residence here at the Mulroney Institute. Sandy, do you want to go first?
Okay,
sure. Put you in the hot seat.
Okay, thank you very much, Asa. Drinhozo, Shoshe Sandy, Dawson City Hooche. My name is Sandy. I represent the community of Dawson City in the beautiful community in Yukon and the traditional territory of the Gwich'in. My comments are going to be really reflected upon my experience in one very specific part of the circumpolar north. And I want to start with asking you all to picture in your mind what Canada looks like, right? It's probably on a map, and you probably have the center in your mind somewhere around Manitoba, maybe Northern Ontario. You see Alaska, maybe the lower 48, possibly Greenland. I did a Google search for this presentation, map of Canada, and it took 250 images before I saw Russia on a map near Canada. And it was a flattened picture of the globe with Russia seemingly worlds away in the east of the United Kingdom. And what you see in these maps, they're not real anyway because of the Mercator effect. It's a map projection that has become the default for classrooms and atlases and eventually Google Maps. And this projection preserves the angles and the shapes that are necessary for navigation, but it drastically inflates the landmass as it approaches the poles. So the average Canadian really has a very limited knowledge of the geography, let alone the people, the culture, the history of this massive and increasingly more exposed region of the circumpolar world. The map on the wall in my office as Premier, it had no Mercator effect on it, and its center is the North Pole. Pete has the same one on his wall, which is great to see. And today, for context, I'm going to speak a little bit about the colonial history of the Yukon. So in 1867, Alaska was purchased from the Russians. And in 1898, gold was discovered both in Alaska and in the Klondike. By 1903, Fort Seward was established in Haines, Alaska, and was fully garrisoned in 1905. Basically as a military threat to the Canadians. There was conflicting opinions on the borders, and the Americans were protecting their interests. In Canada, the Northwest Mounted Police went from a handful of men in 1898 to over 300 members just 2 years later. Tens of thousands of American prospectors came up the Chilkoot Trail and were imposed with Canadian rule and order, and two sovereign nations came to terms with agreeing upon borders in that northwestern corner of North America. Now, the Yukon was governed by a federally appointed commissioner. By 1909, the legislative body known as the Yukon Territorial Council was fully elected. However, the head of the Yukon government remained the commissioner, the federal commissioner, until 1979. Think about that. That's a long time. And that's when territory was given the responsibility of the government. It wasn't again until 2003 that the Yukon Act came into effect, and that gave the government of Yukon administration and control over public lands, water, and natural resources, making its responsibilities very similar to that of provinces. Now, Yukon First Nations are an extremely important part of governance in the territory. First Nations territories, traditional territories, cover pretty much the whole of Yukon. Of the 14 First Nations in Yukon, 11 of those First Nations signed modern treaties between 1993 and 2005. That, at that time, was half of the self-governing First Nations in Canada, Yukon. The North Slope has been home to the Inuvialuit since time immemorial, and the Yukon recognizes this as well with Canada, recognizing as well in the implementation of the Inuvialuit final agreements as well. Very sophisticated governance in the Yukon. After many, so the North, we basically co-govern together the day-to-day activities in cooperation, and we do so after witnessing dozens and dozens of failed national initiatives that were aimed at legitimizing its claim, the federal claim, to the Arctic. And after many, many apologies, Canada has switched from a use it or lose it mentality to a no decisions about us without us switch in philosophy, in an attempt to reconcile having reconciliation as one of the top issues in Canada. So in preparation for this, I wanted to go a little bit before my time and kind of do some research of some of these policies. So I researched the Arctic policy going back to 1997, which is very small compared to what these two gentlemen have researched, I'm sure. But I started with that. There was a report from the All-Party House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade in Canada and the Circumpolar World, where it was suggested there that the Arctic Council, being that mechanism for international dialogue, 2000, the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade came up with the Northern Dimensions of Canadian Foreign Policy. There was mentions of Arctic policy in throne speeches and other documents. Then in 2007, Canada's Northern Strategy, Our North Heritage and Our Future was released. The Department of Foreign Affairs released its statement on Canada's Arctic foreign policy in August of 2010, all before my time in politics. My first meeting, one of my first meetings as Premier of the Yukon, was with the Right Honourable Mary Simon, who, before she was the Right Honourable, who was tasked to complete a new shared Arctic leadership model before her time as Canada's Governor General. Now, her report was an attempt to narrow the long-standing inequalities in transportation, energy, communications, employment, community infrastructure, health, and education. Things that we should enjoy equally right across Canada. And Mary said at that time, and I quote from this documentation, "The simple fact is," and this is kind of a reference to all of those policies I just talked about, "the simple fact is that the Arctic strategies throughout my lifetime have rarely matched or addressed the magnitude of the basic gap between what exists in the Arctic and what other Canadians take for granted," end quote. Mary's work formed the baseline for Canada's Arctic and Northern policy framework. Now, I had the honor of being the Premier for both the first activity and then this greater initiative from the federal government. We worked with First Nations chiefs. We worked with the two other territorial premiers, my ministers, the federal ministers, to create Yukon's chapter. Now, you don't see the chapters, but every jurisdiction was asked to put chapters towards the ANPF is what we'll call it from here on in. The framework goals were guidelines to investments and activities through to 2030, and it recognized Made in Ottawa approaches and policies had not been all that successful. The Yukon sees different risks and opportunities in the other territories and the provinces. The chapters we provided to the Government of Canada prioritized transportation, energy, healthy communities, and housing. Starting to see kind of a parallel here. We listed 6 goals touching on resilience of communities, closing the infrastructure gaps with southern jurisdictions, diversifying an inclusive economy, evidence-based decisions, a scientific approach, using traditional knowledge, ecosystem protection, and reconciliation and self-determination. These are centralized themes that you're going to hear a lot in a lot of the federal policies as well. The ANPF has an international chapter. It articulates Canada's goals and objectives in the circumpolar region by strengthening the rules-based international order of the Arctic. You might have heard our Prime Minister talking about rule-based order in his Davos speeches. More clearly defining Canada's Arctic boundaries, broadening Canada's international engagement to contribute to the priorities of Canada's Arctic. In December of 2024, Canada released their revised statement on the Arctic foreign policy, which supplements the 2019 Arctic and Foreign Policy Statement International Chapter, where we go from a willingness to see Russia return to its census and inserted a lot of the U.S., NATO, Western democracies at its core in this documentation. And that was new. It was very new to have seen NATO in these documentations. ANPF is still a priority according to these documentations. The United States is still our biggest ally in these conversations, and the Arctic Council is still a place for dialogue. But the update is much more dire, and it's focused in on Russia and China and the cooperations therein. The Canadian Coast Guard is now identified as a defense and security partner. And the new ambassador position, our new Arctic ambassador, and 2 new consulates are opened, one in Alaska and one in Greenland, according to the documentation. So the chapters of the ANPF are still a commitment as far as I can understand. But again, this was like pulling teeth just to get this on paper, this documentation. And as we prepare to see the fiscal commitments of Carney's next budget and some of the money that's already been announced, the tension really is growing. Doesn't hurt that, Trump is saying what Trump's saying. And we now have all your attention here, probably because Trump's saying what Trump's saying. We are at a critical point in our history as an Arctic nation because of all this. If we truly want to have internationally recognized claims to our Arctic, and if we truly want it secure, then we need to honor the pages of the ANPF. A lot of sweat and equity went into that from Indigenous leaders right across the circumpolar area, and other stakeholders right across the north. And if we want an opportunity to fund the significant resources needed to accomplish these policies, we need to promote their qualification as dual-use infrastructure as it pertains to our NATO contributions. Last year, Prime Minister Carney met with the premiers and discussed, and I quote, needed investments in dual-use infrastructure in Northern and Arctic communities that will address Canada's Arctic sovereignty and security goals and unlock the North's economic potential, end quote. In May of last year, the Arctic Security Working Group met in Whitehorse. Dual-use infrastructure was discussed extensively over the course of a 2-day seminar, with some central themes emerging in that dialogue. There is a need to better define what constitutes dual-use infrastructure. Also, dual-use infrastructure should be used to achieve both national security and community resilience in the North and the Arctic. To date, Canada has not necessarily created a strict definition of what a dual-use infrastructure is, or an objective list of criteria to evaluate a project, but examples could include upgrades of all seasonal roads, highways, bridges, education, very similar lists that we've been hearing all this time, right? They all sound familiar because they're the things that have been identified by Mary Simon in her collaboration with Northern leaders and her shared Arctic leadership exercise that helped create the nation's ANPF, Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. So with the world turning its attention to the North. And I'm so glad that people are so interested in this topic, because it's really hard to explain over the years that Canada is an Arctic nation. I've gone from Boise, Idaho to London, England, and all places in between, talking to investors and stakeholders on this concept, and different hooks for different reasons, and trying to explain how the importance is of a child's education in our most remote communities is important to your bottom line, to the health and to the safety and security of what it means to be a nation. And we now have a lot more attention now because of what's happening in the geopolitics that we see in the Arctic. But the definition of Arctic sovereignty, as far as Indigenous people in Canada goes, has a big parallel to Greenland's connection to a colonial governance with Denmark. It's a shaky alliance, one that is only secured by a willingness of our nations to coexist inside of self-determination network. I'm going to leave it at that. I know that I didn't speak much about Greenland, but I'm so glad that I had your attention to speak a little bit about my small neck of the woods that I lived in for 30 years and how it relates to the bigger picture of the concepts that we're talking about here today. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sandy. Dr. Lajeunesse.
Well, thank you, Sandy. I suppose I have the dubious honor of talking about some of the threats you alluded to and maybe fleshing out the concept of shaky alliances a little bit more. So what I'm going to be talking about today for about 10 minutes is sort of the security elephant in the room, which is the threats to Greenland. Over the last year, Donald Trump and the United States have renewed some of the threats that we saw coming out of Trump 1.0 towards the sovereignty of Greenland. So what I want to do in 10 minutes is talk about what those threats have been, what exactly the Americans are talking about, whether there's any substantiation to them, and what exactly this is going to do to our alliance, to our partnership, and of course to stability and security in the North. So to start with, let's run through some of the narratives that have been coming out of Washington. Let's talk about, what exactly are the requests or the demands flowing from Washington, and what exactly is behind them. So the first, of course, is China and Russia, right? That is everywhere on the American agenda these days. As we've heard from President Trump, the Chinese and the Russians are this close to invading Greenland. And of course, the island is circled at all times by Russian and Chinese ships. Could you flip up that map there? Now, this is a fascinating map. This is something. This doesn't exist anywhere. I've looked, and with the help of some students, the Institute and one of its research networks have put together an AIS, so a satellite verified map of all Chinese research icebreaker voyages since 1999. So this is where Chinese ships have been for 26 years. And you can see very visually that that's not true. There was one voyage that popped out to Iceland about 10 years ago. So that's it. That's it in a visual nutshell. They're much more interested in Alaska, much more interested in the Western Arctic. Russian ships, likewise, no. Commercial vessels, well, that's a little different, but quite frankly, there's Chinese commercial vessels everywhere. So that's not true. A Chinese and a Russian invasion right around the corner, that's just silly. I don't really need to talk too much about that. Neither power is planning on invading Greenland. Economics and strategic positioning in Greenland. Well, now there's something to this. Now, there is one strategic facility, meaning a facility of great national importance in northern Greenland. So this is the Pituffik, formerly Thule Space Force Base, which has the BMUS intercontinental ballistic missile tracking system. So any ICBMs, meaning the delivery systems that you would expect nuclear weapons to be on, traveling to the United States from either Russia or China, would actually be tracked by this facility in Greenland. So there's some importance there. Now, that being said, under current treaty obligations, the United States has the right to defend, to expand, to do, quite frankly, whatever it wants with this facility. So you have the Danes and the Greenlanders really sitting there scratching their heads wondering, what else could we provide since you have literally everything you could possibly need? So there's not a lot to that. Now, the last factor is, of course, resources. Now, Greenland is rich, has world-class natural resources. iron ore, uranium, and most importantly, something called rare earth elements. Now, rare earths, REEs, critical minerals, different terminology. It's a whole series of different elements that go into pretty much everything that we think of as modern technology, from cruise missiles to space shuttles, satellites, to that laptop right there. And they're all chocked full of Chinese rare earths, because that's where they all come from. 85 to 95%, depending on the rare earth, comes from China. Now, Greenland, an enormous reserve of rare earths, owned partially by China. It's actually owned by an Aussie company, but the Aussie company has what's called an offtake agreement where they agree to send everything to China. Now, of course, all of these other elements, all of these other riches, over the last 10 years, the Chinese have been very interested, a lot of attempts to build infrastructure, build mines. The reality is they've all failed, utterly and completely. Every single Chinese investment ever in Greenland has now failed. The only one that was left as of yesterday was that rare earth mine. And as of yesterday, it failed. The company, the Aussie company yesterday, cut their ties with the Chinese. And that's it. That's literally it. Not a single Russian or Chinese company left anywhere in Greenland. Now, do you need to own Greenland to get these resources? Once again, the Danes and I think the Greenlanders are sitting in nukes, scratching their heads, wondering, what are you talking about? Greenland is, to use the phrase, open for business. In fact, the Greenlanders are very anxious for foreign direct investment to fund ultimate independence. So there's nothing the Greenlanders would like more than American money to flow into mines. So do you want rare earths in Greenland? You actually don't need to conquer the island. You go to Nuuk, you get a mining permit, you put the money into a mine, and you build a mine. That's how you do it. So there's not a lot of rational thought going behind any of these American points. Now, what does this actually mean? Now, why are they doing this? This is something I'm asked, and my colleagues are asked, and the average answer is, oh, nobody knows. There's not an Arctic strategic studies expert anywhere that really has any idea what's going on. The best answer is you talk to a psychiatrist rather than a strategic studies expert, because that's more in their domain. So, but what does this actually mean? Because it started out really funny. We all kind of laughed about this, and then it got really serious because it's done significant damage to the NATO alliance. It's undermined trust between the United States and all of its partners. The reality is an alliance is not a piece of paper. I mean, the North Koreans and the Russians have a piece of paper. You know, what's that worth? An alliance is strong because of genuine trust and a willingness to fight and die for one another. That's what has made NATO so strong since it was founded in the early Cold War. That's beginning to erode now. So too is economic trust. Are the Greenlanders going to continue to put the Americans first on their list of partners they'd like to work with? And they are first, at least if you listen to Greenlandic polling. Yes, the Americans and the Europeans are far above the Chinese and certainly the Russians in who they would like to work with. Now, there's no new polling data that's come out in the last year, but I would start to question whether that's true. Now, the last thing I would talk about is the position of China in the Arctic. Now, I said that they've lost all of their soft power in Greenland. This goes across the whole Arctic, everywhere but Russia. So the whole democratic Arctic was quite happy to embrace China in sort of the 2010s. And a whole bunch of things happened. COVID, Chinese aggressive diplomacy in the South China Sea towards Taiwan, Japan, India, a whole host of different things changed the way democratic countries, and in the Arctic as well, of course, viewed China, viewed Chinese investment, infrastructure projects, and the whole Arctic, Greenland included, and Canada, pulled back from planned partnerships with China. China was no longer a valuable partner. Meanwhile, this whole time, if you look at Chinese propaganda, which I've spent a lot of time reading, you look at all of the Chinese state media, they had propaganda or narrative lines, which was the Chinese were not threatening. They were friendly, useful partners fighting, a win-win battle to support and improve the Arctic, and the Americans were cruel, hegemonic, militaristic, aggressive abusers, give or take. That's the general narrative line that has come out of Chinese state media for the last 10 years. Nobody was buying it. If you actually look at polling across the whole Arctic, nobody was buying it. The last year, the United States government has essentially walked into Chinese propaganda, held that up and say, yep, this is a good fit. I mean, they are in many ways literally writing Chinese propaganda. The propagandists, when you look at their state media, they don't even have to try. They just reprint statements coming out of the US government. So this loss of soft power in Greenland and across the whole Arctic that China has suffered since COVID and thereabouts, is that permanent? When the Greenlanders look for partners in development, are they going to look at the Americans, or are they going to give the Chinese a second thought? So the irony here is what I'll leave you with is that in seeking to undermine NATO and Danish sovereignty, and of course, possibly conquer Greenland, what Donald Trump may have done is revitalize China's Arctic soft power, its investment, its trade, its partnerships all around, while at the same time weakening the NATO that is the main bulwark against Russian aggression, perfectly undermining everything he theoretically had hoped to achieve. So with that very happy note, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kikkert.
Thanks, Dr. Lajeunesse, and thank you all for coming. And a really special thanks to Dr. Zuschlag and Dr. Harling-Stalker for the chance to speak on this panel, to Dr. McKercher for moderating us. It's a real honor to be here with my fellow panelists. And I have the privilege of spending a lot of time on the land, the water, and the ice of the Arctic with first responders and Canadian Rangers. So that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. Who here has heard of the Canadian Rangers before? I'll see. That's, unusual, maybe a bit more now that they're in the news a lot. That's great to see. And, the red hoodies, the part-time reservists who are the eyes and ears of the Canadian Armed Forces in the North. Last year, I was out in the land with Rangers from Kugluktuk and Cambridge Bay in the Western Arctic. And over Tuktoy and Tea, they were describing the travel they do regularly. In a 300-kilometer circle around their community, they are constantly moving and harvesting. They often travel over 500 kilometers between Cambridge Bay and Kugluktuk across ice and water. Some have gone nearly 1,000 kilometers by snowmobile from Cambridge Bay to Yellowknife across the Barrens, terrain very few people have ever set eyes upon. As we passed landmarks all over the land, they pointed out where they had seen outsiders breaking the law, ships where they shouldn't belong, adventurers looting protected areas, all of which they had reported to the armed forces, the Coast Guard, or police, even when not on official ranger operations. They walked me through other ranger roles they have played as emergency responders, on sovereignty and surveillance patrols, as guides supporting military operations. They noted the soldiers from the South they've trained to overcome what the military used to call, the Arctic goblin, that fear of being on the land in darkness, extreme cold, and isolation that is so hard for Southerners to overcome, and I can certainly attest to that. They've been serving as Rangers for decades. Their parents served, their grandparents served, and their sons and daughters are serving, highlighting that Indigenous peoples in Canada's territorial north serve in the Canadian Armed Forces at a far higher rate per capita than Canadians do on average. And this leads to my first point. First, the Arctic is not undefended. And I'm sure some of you have seen that narrative circulating that Canada has demilitarized its Arctic, that it's done nothing. That is incorrect, it's misleading, and in fact, it is insulting. So I don't have time to list everything, but consider the Canada-US North Warning System, its 47 stations keeping watch over the polar horizon for decades, now operated and maintained by the Nassituk Corporation, an Inuit majority-owned company with plans to modernize and improve the system underway. NORAD forward operating locations in critical spots across the region. The Arctic Training Center in Resolute, which has been used by many of our NATO allies to get ground experience in the high Arctic. The Navy's offshore Arctic patrol vessel, which Adam can tell us much more about. The new heavy icebreakers under construction for the Coast Guard. Army units that can rapidly deploy northward in response to crisis situations. The annual and year-round Operation Inuk exercises that the military puts on, often working with a wide array of domestic and international partners. And, of course, the Arctic responders and the Rangers, the Coast Guard auxiliary units, the search and rescue teams, the Guardians, the Inuit Marine Monitors, the harvesters reporting worrisome activities on Siku, the Indigenous Knowledge app, Their eyes on the land are essential and are the perfect alerting system for the types of hybrid gray zone threats that pose the real risk to our north in the short and the medium terms. Things like illicit marine traffic, illegal fisheries, infrastructure sabotage, nefarious foreign research, which Dr. Lajeunesse has written on before. These are threats that they are ideally situated and ideally suited to focus on. And they are the first response to so many safety challenges, from natural hazards to missing adventurers to vessels that have run aground. Of course, there's work to be done, improvements to be made, equipment and capabilities that need to be invested in. Most of all, I would argue, consistent and sustained experience in Arctic conditions for our military and other public safety agencies, and the tools required to build our situational awareness in the region. But that's a far cry from an undefended Arctic. So this leads to my second point. If you want to talk about gaps in Arctic security, I'm going to echo what Sandy Silver has already mentioned to us. Let's talk about NATO's 7 baseline requirements for resilience and for civil preparedness. When people hear NATO and Arctic security, we think jets and warships. But NATO's resilience requirements ask a different question. Can a society function under stress? They include continuity of government, resilient energy, food, and water supplies, effective mass casualty response, strong communications and transportation systems. We have serious gaps here across the north. Communities powered by old diesel plants that are old and vulnerable to everything from extreme cold to cyber attacks to the paper clips and thumbtacks holding them together. Communities where evacuation is extraordinarily difficult. Food insecurity and fragile supply chains are rampant. Water systems that fail for weeks at a time. And I can point to several examples of this in the last months alone, including a major situation in Pruvunattuk in Nunavik, where the community was without water. And I'm not talking about, a boil water advisory, literally without water for 2 months. Very thin emergency response capacity, serious challenges delivering adequate health services, severe communications and transportation limitations affecting over 70 fly-in or sea lift only communities. These are not military gaps, they are resilience gaps, and NATO tells us those are security gaps. Remember, from the ground, geopolitical competition is only one layer of risk, the risk we often focus on, but community vulnerability is the constant one. And here's the final point. We have pathways forward on this. And again, I'm going to echo Sandy here. NATO's call for its members to spend 5% of their GDP can be broken into 3.5% for kind of hard military defense and 1.5% for what has been called, total security, spending on civil preparedness and resilience requirements. Funding in this category opens up the space for creative, innovative, transformative solutions to address the long-standing infrastructure, communication, and transportation gaps limiting resilience in the Arctic. In the past, and this is well documented, defense and security initiatives have not benefited Northern Indigenous peoples and have often hurt them. This is a chance to rectify this and work in the North, for the North, with the North. As so many of our Northern Indigenous leaders have pointed out in recent months, Indigenous governments, communities, and corporations, they are ready and they are willing to co-develop. And I'll end with a plug for the folks I most often work with. If Canada wants to bolster Arctic security and safety, it must invest in the people who already provide it. The Rangers, the Coast Guard Auxiliary, the Guardians, the Monitors, the volunteer search and rescue teams, other first responders, and often this is the same person who are members of all of them, right? Northerners wear a lot of hats in the North, right? And these are not nice social programs. They are the foundation of Canada's Arctic security architecture. They are the ones who can immediately improve our domain awareness across the Arctic, one of the most common criticisms of our Arctic defense posture. Provide them with the equipment, the training, and funding they need to improve their effectiveness, from low-cost equipment like drones and thermal imaging cameras to new boats to better compensation for their service, much of which, outside the Rangers, is done on a voluntary basis. These investments into local capacity must be supported by sustained efforts to build trusts and relationships. The reason my Ranger friends report what they see is simple. They're stitched into our safety and security systems as trusted partners. Trust determines whether people call for help, whether they share information, whether they cooperate, and you cannot surge trust during a crisis. You build it beforehand. This is where reconciliation becomes operational. If NATO says resilience is the foundation of security, and resilience in the Arctic depends on the trust with Indigenous and Northern communities, then reconciliation is not separate from security policy. It is a prerequisite for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kikkert. A very spirited presentation. I'm going to work my way back this way, if you like, and I'm going to build on your sort of final point there about trust, Dr. Kikkert. Obviously, Mr. Carney paid his first foreign visit to becoming after Prime Minister, but just about a year ago, to Europe, and then after that, he made his way into the Arctic on his return trip. I think signaling very symbolically his priorities in terms of sort of foreign and defense policy. As the Canadian government sort of expands its military presence in the north, what does that look like in terms of the sort of trust, speed of trust, if you like, with Indigenous groups and Northerners in general? What does that look like, I guess? Or what would you, I guess, in an ideal world, what would that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a good thing to highlight. Carney's visit, to the Arctic and his visit to Iqaluit, and you got to remember, the Prime Minister standing, sitting or not sitting, standing and talking in the hangar in front of a yellow and red helicopter, right? And for Northerners, that means something very specific, right? That's a search and rescue helicopter from the military. Only that helicopter is not stationed in Iqaluit. That helicopter was actually not one of the search and rescue helicopters that often goes north. It was there for a tactical military operation. But when Northerners saw that, they're like, oh, finally, we're going to get what we've been asking for a long time, a helicopter in Iqaluit. And it's like, well, that's not. So I think, you want to start operating at the speed of trust. You have to be you have to build that trust through being honest and through thinking about the implications of your messaging, your strategic messaging, where you're posing in front of. And, I think that's a critical step. But most importantly is just maintaining the relationships, building the relationships, being there in person, having the same folks working on these files on an ongoing basis. That's critical. So Northerners, when I talk to them, they are tired of having to explain the same thing to a dozen different faces from the South. That's not productive. That's not consistent. They're re-explaining the same message again and again and again. Dual use infrastructure. Well, how do we do it? You know how many different studies and different roundtables and different meetings there have been about this? Northerners are on record about how to do this. Listen to them, right? Listen to them. I work a lot with the Coast Guard, and they have prioritized, operating at the speed of trust, and they do that by, again, having the same faces in the communities on an ongoing basis to do training, to do exercises, to deliver these kind of critical pieces of equipment that are required by these responders to do their jobs, right? That's how you operate at the speed of trust, right? And I would say the Coast Guard is actually approaching, and I'm going to, paraphrase Shiloh Klutze here, they're able to operate at the speed of empathy. I mean, they understand, I think, what's going on in the north, the risks that Northerners face, and how to operate in that, that region. And I think the Coast has done a great job of advancing reconciliation and improving Canada's safety and security in the north. I'll just say one thing too, while we're talking about operating at the speed of trust. It's interesting we're having these conversations, and obviously the U.S. is going to be the elephant in the room, right? But again, spending time on the land, on operations with a lot of our American allies. That collaboration's been built over years and years, and it's the kind of collaboration, right, that has happened on a handshake, right? There's a famous story where Adam was mentioning Thule, right, and it's kind of hard to resupply Thule, right? Like it's pretty up there, and so they do an airlift all year round. They've been doing this since the 50s. In the late 1980s, the Americans ran into trouble because they used to resupply that every year with an icebreaker on the East Coast. But all of a sudden, that American icebreaker broke down, and the Americans have almost no icebreakers. I mean, they're fixing that, right? Slowly, but they're, and so again, no way to resupply this strategically important base. The commander of the U.S. Coast Guard contacted the commander of the Canadian Coast Guard and said, hey, can you lend us one of your icebreakers? We need this icebreaker to break into Thule so we can resupply them for the year so that our service people can have some nice food every once in a while, and more importantly, we can get our strategic resources up there. On a handshake, the Canadian Coast Guard did that, right? And then in 1993, that agreement was formalized, and we've been resupplying that air base ever since, that space base ever since, right? Operation Pacer Goose. And right now we have tactical helicopters that are flying from Edmonton to Alaska to participate in 5 weeks of military training with our close partners, right? So I don't know. I'm not very optimistic, obviously, about the state of our relationship and our trust with our premier ally there. But at the same time, I am hopeful that maybe those on-the-ground relationships can help sustain some of that trust. We have to collaborate, and I'm hopeful there. So again, just a few comments. Thanks for the question.
Thanks very much. Adam, I have a question, or Dr. Lajeunesse, pardon me. I have a question for you. Brian Mulroney once called the Arctic Canada's lock, stock, and iceberg. Someone wrote a use that for a book title, I think. Is good. What do kind of the U.S. attempts to annex Greenland, which you I think put in great perspective there, what does that actually mean for Canada's own relationship with the Americans, specifically in the North?
Yeah, that is, I'd say that's the question of the day. I think that's the question of tomorrow. I want to backtrack a little bit and make a pitch as well. So the tracking of American statements on Greenland that we are undertaking with some students, we are tracking everything that's happening, is available online at naadson.ca, naadsn.ca. So that's a Mulroney Institute effort, along with partners at NADSN, to track in real time some of these narratives about Greenland and feed those into global affairs and decision making. We're doing the same thing for Canada next, which is concerning to me because I never thought I'd have to do that, tracking American government and sort of MAGA influencer statements about Canada. So, what is that threat? Is there a real threat to Canadian Arctic sovereignty? The reality is the threat is possible, but it's very different. So Greenland is an island. The question here is entirely about land, right? Sovereignty, annexation, whatever you want to call it, of land. The Canadian context is very different. The threat has always been to the maritime environment. So since the late 1940s, no American government has ever challenged or even thought of challenging Canadian sovereignty to any of our Arctic territory. The issue is whether or not the United States recognizes Canadian sovereignty over the Northwest Passage. So we have a very different legal interpretation. Canada says these are historic internal waters. They are as Canadian, and we have as much control over them as we do Antigonish Harbor. The United States says that these are international straits that run through the islands. And of course, American warships or any foreign warships or vessels can go through as they like. Now, this is a legitimate legal debate. I mean, both sides have good points. But since the 1950s, there has been a realization within every single American administration, and I've tracked all the documents, that there's no point in fighting this. So why would we make this a thing? Why would we risk our entire relationship, the defense relationship with Canada in the Arctic and everywhere, over a legal dispute over the status of the Northwest Passage? And every American administration has arrived at the same conclusion, which is, well, we'll maintain the dispute because we have to, but we're not going to fight it. We're not going to push this forward. The Trump administration may be the first to take a different approach because fundamentally, that administration's approach to the world is less built on relationships and long-term planning than its predecessors. It is more transactional, and it's not meant as an insult. It is real, I think, a statement of obvious fact. It is much more transactional, meaning that it wants to win immediate gains. So what you had in Trump 1.0, first one, was actually something very worrying, which was real statements about challenges to Canadian Arctic sovereignty. First ever. Challenges and conversations about running a freedom of navigation voyage, which is where an American warship or icebreaker puts the biggest flag it's got out and it charges through the waters to say, we don't recognize your sovereignty. The Americans are doing this in the South China Sea, deservedly, all the time. They've never done that in the Arctic. There was conversations about doing that in Trump 1.0. Now, how true this is, conversations with unnamed American Coast Guard officers have suggested that there was perhaps a bit of an effort to dissuade the U.S. government. And as Peter said, for generations, the two services, Coast Guard, Navy, Defense, they've worked in this perfect, I shouldn't say perfect, but a very tight, trustful partnership. And in Trump 1.0, I think the Coast Guard basically convinced the American government not to do that. Now, here we are in Trump 2.0, very different dynamic. And of course, this deep state, as he would call it, or the entrenched bureaucracy is not quite as strong. So the big question is not sovereignty annexation for Canada, but would Donald Trump, out of spite for some perceived slight, trade with China or something, would he be willing to throw that defense relationship onto the pyre in order to win that legal dispute over the Northwest Passage? My whole career, I have consistently said, no, that's crazy. However, here we find ourselves a year into a potential threat to Greenland, and what is crazy is now distinctly possible. So if you're watching the Canadian scene, watch for American government or influencers starting to talk about the Northwest Passage. And when you see that, there you see the tip of the iceberg.
That was a good pun at the end, if anyone caught that. Sandy, I wonder if I could ask you, obviously, as a territorial premier, obviously most of your brief is to deal with internal matters, domestic matters, if you like. But I imagine you had relationships with other territories, not Northwest Territories and Nunavut, but other territories in the Arctic Circle, like Iceland and Greenland. I wonder if you have any sort of insights from your travels to those territories or interactions with those figures from those places.
What these guys have been saying has just pumped me right up, though. I get so much to say about what they've said. Oh my God. I'll answer this question kind of in a parallel to what Pete was saying about. I'm going by first names here, fellas. So, all due respect. That was an important statement about Carney coming in and making a bold statement and falling flat too with borrowed props, right? I have a story that relates to us heading to Iceland and Greenland. Myself, the Premier of Northwest Territories, Carolyn Cochrane, and PJ Agiakuk, the Premier of Nunavut. So the way that we work is we don't get a lot of attention from the federal government because 1, 2, 3, that's 3 MP seats right across the vast the Arctic of Canada, right? And so strength in numbers. We start with the Northern Premiers Conferences, and we start talking about we really need, how do we drum up that support for Arctic sovereignty and security, right? And this is going back some. This is before Trump 2.0. I was elected premier on I believe a Monday, and Trump was elected the president the very next day, by the way. So it was like my sister from Boston was visiting at the time. She was like, "Yay!" And then she's like, "Oh." And so strength in numbers, we would always get the communique going from the north first. Then we were part of the Western Premiers Conference as well. So it's the 3 territorial premiers. We'd then join Saskatchewan West, and we would have communique there. So we would then drum up support there and say, look, we really think we need to do more when it comes to the circumpolar conversations. The territories have never been to Arctic Council, for example, and so they were suspended because of the illegal invasion at Crimea at that time. But we were still hell-bent of doing this. And so how do we do this in the proper way? We need to get the federal government engaged as well. And so the Western premiers agreed violently with us that this was a priority. And then we went on to the Council of Federation and had the conversation there, and then to the First Ministers meetings, which is all the premiers and the Prime Minister. And we really felt this sense where, the nation was really understanding the urgency and being like, hey, we definitely need these 3 to go and have those conversations. But we need to do more, was what we were told by Ottawa. And there was a big plan that, in the summertime, what we're going to do is, the federal government, they would come up and have a conversation, like Trudeau was going to show up, and we were going to have this big moment with the leaders and really kind of solidify that whole conversation of no decision about us without us as the national policy when it comes to like replacing some of the failed experiments, like using northerners like human flagpoles in these very, very northern Arctic areas and saying use it or lose it, that type of thing. And so we're like, this is great. We have the ears, and so it was kind of a buy-in too, because when the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework was happening, it was a dog's breakfast of trying to get information from the federal government, but also to get buy-in from the Indigenous leaders of the North, because been there, done that, got the T-shirt. You're just going to put this thing on the shelf. It's not going to mean anything, and we're going to spend all this time giving you our knowledge. And what are you going to do with it, right? And then there was a threat that there's going to be money attached, and then there was like so we finally got the chapters together. We finally said we're going to do this Arctic conversation in Greenland and Iceland. And good news, we're also going to meet in Cambridge Bay. So I head over to Iceland first. PJ and Caroline didn't go to Iceland, but we're all going to meet in Nuuk in Greenland. And I'm the first person to see PJ come off the plane, and big hugs. It's like, hey, how's it going? He goes, and I don't, for anybody who knows PJ, he's the nicest guy you'll ever meet in the whole world. His family is part of that bizarre experiment of forced relocation, and yet he's still a proud Canadian. Like, like he's one of my favorites in the world. Like he's just such a resilient individual and great hunter and a great provider and good person, and also did a lot of the negotiations for the Inuvialuit's final agreements and all that stuff. He was like, he was beside himself. I was like, what's going on? He said, well, remember that kumbaya moment that we're supposed to have, and we're all supposed to get together and have this big announcement together? Yeah, well, Trudeau and his office called. They're showing up today in Cambridge Bay, and I'm heading to Greenland. So, they went out there, and Anita Nan was there as well. They did this big speech, and in the speech they said to get, no decisions about us without us, which was pretty ironic because us were not there, right? So again, like this is it. Like it baffles anybody who knows the North, this type of engagement, because you take a look at sophisticated land claims, you take a look at sophisticated First Nations governance in Canada, look no further than the North, right across the circumpolar. And it's extremely important to all of you that care about the environment that these communities have sophisticated governments. And we're talking about it today because of this threat that we're seeing with this new hemisphere, new world order that may or may not happen. But this is important to our critical mineral strategy. This is important to the shipping lanes. This is important to everything that we have in these communities. If you care about this country, that we have sophisticated First Nations and Indigenous leadership in these communities, because that's where the negotiations happen, and that's where the real rubber hits the road. It's so important that the governments, the mining companies, whoever is engaging in the North understands the engagement with these governments of people, and that investment is so critical to us as a nation. I'll just end with this too. Is Pete talked a lot about the Rangers. I just want to add on that conversation. Pete forgot one thing, just one small thing, which is massive. These are superheroes, like they really are. Think about this. In the North, we have a lost generation because of residential school, right? So you have parents that really want to teach their kids, but it's hard because you have this whole lost generation. So you want to tell them about grandpa's trap line, but you don't even know where it is because you were stolen from the land. The Rangers initiatives, this is what it is. They're out on the land, right? They're out on the land with the students, and you go out there with those students that are in the junior ranger program, and these students that struggle in the colonial school system, they are out there thriving because they're on their grandfather's land, and they're and the trap lines, and they're being reintroduced to all of this, and the Rangers are really the mechanism that kind of holds this all together. If I'm trying to teach something in my planning class, which is this like bird class in high school, like I teach math, but then I have to do these other classes. I could try my best to try to teach, like real life skills, first hunt, first fish, that type of thing. I don't know. I'm okay. The Rangers come in, and the kids are so engaged, right? They're those are the superheroes of the next generation, and they bring self-worth into the next generation as well, which is extremely important as we have this conversation.
Okay, well, now it's the part of the thing that I like the best, which is to hear from you. So I'm going to wander. I'll wander as I wander. Hopefully you've got some questions. We just scratched the surface. There's climate change issues, Indigenous sovereignty issues, Crown-state relations, all kinds of things we could unpick. We have a Dane in the class. I don't want to put him on the spot, but we could get a Danish perspective on things. I'm not sure. Question? Oh, no, there's other people too. Yeah. You have a question?
Yeah. I know.
Oh, sure.
Hey, you guys. Yeah, I'm from Denmark. Thank you. Yeah, a little bit about me. Like I'm actually a history major, so I only have like one class in political science. So yeah, but I plan to, when I get back to Denmark, to possibly switch to political science, which is why I'm here as well. Right. My question is that earlier you mentioned something about how especially the Trump administration used misinformation against their allies. How would you say that this strategy is like, so like, I'm sorry, I'll have to, yeah. How would you say that the Trump administration used this kind of misinformation with today and social medias and such, like to, in a way, to achieve their goals?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. What we've seen over the last year, give or take, is something that would be called a shaping environment or narrative shaping. So to put it simply, what's happening is it's a bit of a spaghetti against the wall strategy. So we have an objective in mind, which is the annexation of Greenland. We're not quite sure why we need to do that, but we know we need to do that. So let's see what rationale we can test. So this shaping environment is an attempt to use all of these different rationales that I talked about. So Chinese ships, Russian invasion, rare earths, strategic defense of North America, and you can actually see them in real time trying different things to see what anchors in public consciousness, what resonates, what polls well. Now, nothing has yet polled really well, either with the domestic public or with Greenlanders, but we're at a bit of a pause now, and we're going to see if that continues. And so we're all excited to see what the next one is.
Can I jump in that for a sec? Just while we're on the topic of disinformation, and not to embarrass him, but I'm going to highlight some work that Adam has done with his colleagues, Troy Buffard and Whitney Lockenbauer. You wrote a piece a couple of years ago where you said, what are the Russians trying to achieve with their strategic messaging and their disinformation campaigns focused on the Arctic? And you said they had a few primary objectives: to assert that U.S. colonialism and interference was rampant in internal Arctic state affairs, that the U.S. and NATO are destabilizing forces in the Arctic, that the U.S. uses its smaller allies as pawns in its global strategy, that the U.S. are poor house guests, and that fears of Russia's military action should be considered paranoid. Did you ever think that it would be the President of the United States forwarding those messages instead of those thousands of Russian bots? So, you definitely caught it. You just, you know what I mean?
Hooray.
It's a deflated balloon noise, I think. Yeah, there.
Thanks. One of you brought up the topic of NORAD as one of the many things that we lean on Greenland, our partnerships with the U.S., their access to those bases, et cetera, et cetera. As I listen to further rhetoric happening from the U.S. towards Canada about how NORAD might be affected if we don't agree to buy a bunch of F-35 from them, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the kinds of things, as a layperson, thinking about the broader North American security concerns, that are so rooted in their fulfillment in the North. I'm wondering if any of you would offer any commentary on the relevance or idleness of those threats. I can't remember which function of the U.S. Constitution it is that one would lean into to declare their leader completely mentally incapacitated, and there's clearly no momentum, I don't feel, from any level of the U.S. government right now to actually lean into that, despite the many occasions I think he's given for them to take advantage of it. But when I listen to those commentary about F-35s making NORAD a challenge, like they're coming at it from so many angles, and I wonder if any of you would comment on that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, Sandy. I'm sure you have a lot to say about that too. I did see that. So right now, Canada is deciding between the Swedish Griffin and the American F-35. Broad strokes, the F-35 is the better plane, but we would be totally reliant upon the American supply chains for software upgrades and parts. And is that a thing we want to be reliant upon? That's the big question out there. So to push us to the F-35, the Americans have recently said, well, NORAD, which is the binational defense of the whole continent, might be in danger. Now, there's a couple things to point out there. One is that, well, NORAD is very important for the Canadian continental defense picture. It's not important for the defense of the North. So NORAD watches the North to see what's coming through it to the South. Nobody's attacking the North. The Chinese aren't sending missiles to the North. The Russians aren't doing that. Second, NORAD is as important or more important to the United States than it is to Canada. Who are the Russians more likely to attack? Let's phrase it that way. And so if the Americans would like to withdraw from NORAD, they are free to lose all of Canada's situational awareness that comes from the North Warning System, our new over-the-horizon radars we're putting in, all of the maritime surveillance, you create a massive black hole right between you and the Russians and the Chinese. Now, is that something the United States would like to do? So if that is a threat that they'd like to continue on with, I think there are obvious responses from the Canadian side.
Yeah, I'll just add a bit on that. Like that, we've been hearing about this upcoming modernization programming, and the billions of dollars that are going to have a very positive impact on the North, the northern communities, and building resilience. But Adam's correct. The billions of dollars that have been announced so far for supporting for NORAD, much of that's not going to be spent in the North at all, right? It's going to be expected to be spent on Southern firms, specializing equipment and services. For the Yukon context, though, maximizing the legacy benefits of NORAD investments make it a priority for the Yukon. That modernization plan, assembling, is Canada must look closely at the assets that can be used for the community, again for dual use purposes. Right, there is a niche market in there that we could actually accomplish. And again, I'll go back to the Rangers. Right, a key focus of any of this NORAD spending will be, for the Yukon anyway, the Canadian Rangers. Critical facet of the Arctic security, as Pete went on about, and he nailed it really. That's how we're going to be able to utilize any of that NORAD spending. Good example of that. Pete mentioned a bit of, which the Operation Nanook, which involves the Yukon government, the Rangers, the governments and NGOs, an opportunity to capacity build and to actually use that technology and use that infrastructure on the more community side of that dual infrastructure piece.
Yeah, I should note, Sandy, you're right. So the new radars we're putting into Southern Ontario. So that's where they're going to monitor the North. Yeah. So, yeah, it's around Thunder Bay, I think.
Lots of rhetoric which has come out of the Trump administration in regards to Greenland has been, we need it for the Golden Dome. Is there any actual based claim in that it serves the U.S. and missile defense?
No. So the Golden Dome is not a thing yet. It's a concept.
Concepts of a plan, I think.
Yes. If you ask what is it, nobody knows. Best guess, based on initial projections, is it is a violation of the Outer Space Treaty to weaponize space through interceptors placed on basically like big SpaceX super heavies, in essence. So you would use the same radars in Greenland as you always would, but there's no additional requirement for Greenland.
Is there existing infrastructure connected to sort of the standard ballistic missile defense stuff, going back to George W. Bush administration?
Yep. I mean, it's there. The Americans have access to it.
Yeah.
Nothing new is needed.
Yeah, exactly.
And just as we go to the next question, as we're scratching our head as to why Trump is doing what he's doing in Greenland, I might make the argument that all of this is building fodder for negotiations of the new NAFTA. Right. I mean, we can follow the model the last time. Right. The only difference now is they're a little bit more organized. When I was the chair of the Council of Federation, the Prime Minister tasked the premiers to go down to Washington in July of the first year of the Trump administration to bestow the virtues of free trade in Canada. And Prince Edward Island went to talk about the importance of trade with PEI because their number one export is aerospace technology, right? So there's all this amazing stuff that we don't even know about, the amazing things that we do to consider ourselves the number one trading partner of the Americans. And so they get sworn in January. We go down there in June, and he's supposed to hire in caucus 350 souls and had hired 32 by that point. So we're watching the exact same thing play out this time as Trump 1.0. The only difference now is they're a lot more organized. If believe it or not, they're a lot more organized this time.
So my question is this: being that the Golden Dome, I guess it's called, doesn't exist, but Trump is really putting it out there as it's a necessary security, whatever, for the United States, for the Northern Hemisphere, and that Canada and Greenland are going to be covered by this, being that they can't actually build any of this stuff without our resources and Greenland's and Venezuela's. They need a combination of all three. They have to import from all three of ours. Otherwise, they have to go to China. What do you think about the relation to that and the rhetoric that's being pushed from the security strategy that was published in November from the United States government?
Well, they can definitely build it without us and the Venezuelans. So all of the natural resources, all of the tech, they've got that already. So there's not really a requirement for Canadian, Greenlandic, rare earths, or Venezuelan oil. Over the long term, that's important, but right now they can source that from anywhere. So Golden Dome, in concept, is like a Sidewinder AIM-9 missile strapped on a Falcon Heavy or something like that. So they can do those things. Whether it will work is TBD, but they don't need us for that per se.
To me, it seems like a lot of nations' Arctic strategies is predicated on global shipping lanes being opened up, like the ice caps melting. My question is to you, how does Canada's Arctic strategy prepare to shift with global climate? Thanks.
I mean, I would just say a caution, right, to this idea that our waters are opening up and they're going to be teeming with a lot of activity. I mean, the reality of climate change in the Canadian archipelago is that as perhaps parts become a bit more accessible, large parts are becoming even less accessible, right? The way the ice is shifting, the way it's working, you're getting a lot of hard ice and some very, vulnerable choke points, literally choking off parts of the passage pretty consistently. So, could there be an significant increase in Arctic shipping in the coming years? Potentially. Absolutely. And we got to be prepared for that. We got to start thinking about that. And we have been thinking about that. But I would just say, again, this idea that suddenly the passage can become a teeming place for international shipping, that in my opinion has been somewhat overblown in the media and does not really belie the conditions that are on the ground in the north. That said, we do see more traffic. We do see more resource traffic. We see more community resupply traffic. We see more adventurer traffic across the north. So to better prepare for that, I think we're taking a lot of positive steps. Again, the construction of new icebreakers for the Canadian Coast Guard is critical. Those Arctic and offshore patrol ships that are being run by the Navy and by the Coast Guard, they're going to be very helpful for that. But again, building that community capacity is going to be that front line, that foundational piece that's going to be really important for addressing that increased shipping. It is a real issue. It's a real threat. It's a real risk. You probably saw the Thunberg that was run aground for a good portion of the summer this summer. That was very lucky that didn't turn into an environmental, a major environmental response. I think we need to do a lot more work in terms of preparing for how to respond to an oil spill or fuel spill in the north. There's probably nothing harder than trying to clean up spilled oil in an icy environment, and we're still figuring out how to do that. So, steps are being taken. I think these can be accelerated, but I would just caution that the whole narrative that this is going to become a thriving shipping zone, I don't think the proof is there yet. And maybe there's some disagreement on that, but
no disagreement. I would just add, just to build on what Peter was saying, keep in mind you need a couple things for shipping. You need open water, but you also need the depth required to bring big ships through. If you're going to do things cheaply, ships have to be very big. Northwest Passage is not only poorly surveyed, but it's very shallow. And of course, extremely variable. So, I've been through a couple of times and, half the transit will be totally ice-free. And then you get to Victoria Strait, where I literally slept in my boots because I need to be on deck fast because there was so much old ice scraping against the hull. It was not a very pleasant environment. So shipping routes, no, a lot of cruise ships, a lot of fishing vessels resupply, but big international firms, they're not showing up.
But I want to say thank you for mentioning the environment in this conversation, because it seemed like for years before the Trump 2.0 and the urgency and the economic opportunities, we've seen the Guggenheims talking about trillions of dollars of investment in those passageways because of the increase or the decrease in shipping costs, and yet. I had the opportunity for Canada's C3 mission to be up at Herschel Island in Yukon, the very, very northern tip of like our part of the Arctic, and I went to Herschel Island where we were escorted in with the Canada Coast Guard, with a military attaché, and we saw these massive swaths of land that are now just like they're just slumping right into the ocean right now, right? And it's crazy to see because, in the oral history of the Indigenous folks up there, they've never seen that before, right? And so the Arctic is changing drastically, and this is the canary in the coal mine for everybody. The world is changing around us, and yet we saw this massive turn to like, what an economic opportunity because of these Northwest Passages. So if you read the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, again, please go and read that. It's very important. A lot of sweat and equity has gone into that from the Indigenous leadership. It has chapters on the environment. And it mentions the fact that not only do we need the dual use infrastructure that hopefully the NATO contributions are going to give us, but remember this too, we have to rebuild up in the north because, the town that I lived in for 30 years, Dawson City, it's built on a frozen mud flap. And it's melting, right? So not only are we needing new infrastructure just to get the same opportunities as Canadians, as the rest of you enjoy being down here in the lower provinces, but we also have to reinvest in the ideas of how we rebuild, right? Our buildings have to be a lot more conscientious to the changing environment around us. So it's extremely expensive taxpayers' money if we don't consider that in the dual infrastructure, but also it's not build back normal, it's build back better.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to highlight. Climate change, 100%. And we're talking about security and risk and what is challenging these NATO baselines for resilience. Yeah, I mean, a lot of that is the effects of climate change. You're talking about, Dawson and the river not freezing as regularly as it used to be, and that creates a whole bunch of transportation issues. Tuktoyaktuk talking about relocating, Saluit talking about relocating. It's a real risk, and then again. I do a lot of work on search and rescue, climate change and search and rescue. I mean, for Northerners, this is the lived experience. And this is why in Nunavik, they have 15 times more search and rescue cases per capita than British Columbia, which is supposed to be the busiest territory in the country. And that's largely due to the changes of climate. So, I mean, it's a really challenging, that makes it a very challenging operating environment, one that is only going to get more challenging. So, yeah, thanks for highlighting that.
That's good. So beach season's coming up.
Some observations which I don't want to draw any conclusions from, but maybe you could. Changes that the Americans are not interested in defending Canada, and they probably wouldn't gain much by taking Toronto and Montreal. And in the past, the dew line was way up north, and you observed that the over-the-horizon radar is in Ontario, so this is not Arctic right. So I might have thought earlier that Greenland was just a stalking horse for the Americans to say we need the Canadian Arctic for radar stations, but that's not true anymore. Right? Over-horizon radar is very different. And the other observation is that you mentioned that most of the technology that relies on rare earth minerals and stuff comes from China and their stock of rare earth minerals. And the Chinese are interested in competition. And it was pointed out that they failed in Greenland, but they've had massive failures in Africa as well. The failures might be worse for the people in Africa than it is for the Chinese. But competition to that, if we're talking about Canadian sovereignty and and the Americans being so transactional, we have great stocks of rare earth minerals. But that would require government determination to exploit them in order to compete on the global market. So, I mean, there's just some observations.
I mean, rare earths are very important. They're in the news everywhere. Let me explain a little bit why China owns this market. Previously, the Americans, through their Mountain Pass mine in California, produced most of the critical rare earths that were required up to the 1990s. Now, what happened was the Chinese were able to leverage their significant natural resources and undercut the Americans and everybody else in the world by basically pricing them way below the market. Now, you can do that if you're willing to pay very little to your workers and if you're willing to ignore horrendous environmental damage done to Outer Mongolia and the area where all these mines are. They're very damaging to the environment to mine these elements if it's not done properly. So the Chinese are willing for decades to take those costs, and so they have come to dominate that entire market. So the question about rare earths is not necessarily finding more. So if Canada or the United States went and developed Greenland, they could not be developed economically. And even if they were, all of the world's, or 90-ish% of the world's refining is in China. So what is required, and everyone basically agrees, is a government effort to subsidize mining and refining companies that would never be profitable on the open market because they're undercut by the Chinese, and to do this not as an economic effort, but as a strategic effort in the way that we develop oil and uranium, regardless sometimes, or in the past we have regardless sometimes of the cost. So that's kind of the dynamic at play.
The policy piece has been something the mining industry has been looking for as well. Flow-through shares, for example, as a national policy is extremely important to the mining industry. Yukon has 25 of the 31 critical minerals listed for Canada. We're heavily involved in the joint action plan between our list and the American list. Our list, in my mind, is more on a environmental basis, which is we could actually see ourselves getting more and more off fossil fuels if we invest more in the recycled nature of these of the critical minerals list in Canada. I'm going to add to that, though, another thing that China does that we've noticed in the Yukon. So Selwyn Qigong was a company that was considered a junior company in Canada and in Yukon, and it was sitting on one of the largest copper reserves in the world in this border between the Northwest Territories and Yukon. That company had no intent of ever getting any of that out of the ground. They were monopolizing the industry, right? They're keeping these areas at play and investing heavily into the community. Like you see junior companies showing up in my area in Dawson City, and they don't have 2 dimes to rub together sometimes, and they're usually grassroots and from the community, all that. This company was different. They had condos in Whitehorse, and they had investments in the Indigenous populations, which is great because the Indigenous folks are like, well, this Chinese-led company is fantastic, right? And no minerals are ever going to come out of the ground. So not only do they have the wherewithal and they have the resources and the refining capability, they're also locking down minerals in our communities. There's a federal law that needs to change where if you were a major company, you do have to report a lot of things that if you're a junior company, you do not. And so what we did notice in the Yukon was the national companies out of China were using that to their advantage and coming in and locking our resources. You think about China and their resources, you don't think about them existing in Canada.
Thank you. We've been talking about Canada both like in a national sense as a country, but then also regional and Arctic, and looking at really talking about different types or different levels of government. So, Indigenous self-governing and, being the premiers of the territories. But when we talk about the U.S., we tend to talk about it as a monolith, which, understandably, Trump sort of takes out all the oxygen in the room. But if we look at the Arctic, the Americans that are immediately there are those in Alaska. So is it worth looking at, or could you comment sort of on, what is the thought of those in Alaska on what is going on? And when we talk about, the North, nothing about us without us, I suspect, the Alaskans would also sort of like to see the same and not just have a government, very south to them sort of dictating. And I think we've seen things like, when Trump first came to power a year ago, I think it was the mayor of Anchorage, maybe, who, was putting out messaging, hey, still come see us, to our northern friends. And, the city of Sitka was saying, we'll take Canadian dollars, dollar for dollar. And they don't want to lose, tourism or relationships. So is there sort of, also a value in looking at the immediate partners there, and maybe regionalism in some cases may matter more than nationalism?
That's a fantastic question, and the answer is yes, and that's exactly what we did. We had such great engagement. There's laws in Canada where a lot of the Indigenous folks don't see that border at all, right? There's families that go right across, and so that's a strength, right? A strength in cooperation between those nations. A lot of times we joke as Alaskan Yukoners that we should just annex ourselves from the whole thing and just create a whole new country, because we think differently up there. That's a massive place in the north. Like, you look at the territories, we have zero population compared to Alaska. You look at the success of the corporate industries in Alaska, 11 of their top corporations are indigenously run. Like, they're eating our lunch when it comes to cooperative governance as well, in a lot of ways, right? And Dunleavy, their governor, huge Trump fan, but he's an Alaskan first, right? And, immediately after the pandemic and during the pandemic, very, very helpful to our small little neck of the woods. There's a highway that runs through Yukon into Alaska called the Shakwack Highway. Well, the Alaskans don't call that. They call it the Alaskan Highway. We call it Shakwack because it's in Canada. And that's more of a colloquial term to the Indigenous people too. But so there's a lot of infrastructure that's already been tried, tested, and true from the mostly libertarian people that live in Alaska. They're not bound and determined by the federal government, and really they a lot of their infrastructure dollars, depending on whoever is in Washington, it changes. Sometimes they can actually say to us, hey, put some money into the Alaska Highway. By the way, that highway that goes through a community of 50 people has to be to a military standard, right? It's crazy. Like, you go to my community, a 500-kilometer long road, it's all chip seal. You go up through Alaska Highway into Alaska through Burwash, and you have this beautiful state-of-the-art highway. And so in times we're saying, look, we can't do what you want, and they listen, like they really do, and so they finance the money. But whenever their federal government gets involved, it's like pulling teeth. It really is. So I think what I'm getting at is, I think the institutions, and Pete mentioned that as well, as far as the cooperations, those are tried and tested over years and years and years, right? And we did see it during the pandemic, and we did see again when in the trade wars that we live in now, our Alaskan brothers and sisters really embrace Canada and the small communities. So even though you do have an awful lot of Republican leadership there, they pushed that aside and said, we're Northerners first. So yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I was just add on. I mean, Senator Murkowski certainly always has some pretty strong feelings about the current administration, and I think does capture a certain amount of that Alaskan population, but I think you answered it great. I would just also highlight the Indigenous connections that unite Alaska to various parts of our north, whether directly through the close lineage, Gwich'in, or through the Inuit Circumpolar Council. There's just a lot of connection there as well that I think is often mobilized to further kind of Indigenous governance interests across the circumpolar world. So I find that very positive as well. And more tactically, Alaska Air National Guard, in terms of how they assist Canadians, they often respond to situations going on in Yukon. For instance, there was a helicopter crash there last year where these Air Guardsmen were the first people on scene, crossing that border, because this is how we collaborate and how we cooperate. And I think those are good positive signs, and I'm not sure exactly what they mean, but as long as they keep on happening, I do take solace.
Dr. Kikkert, you talked briefly on Canada's military readiness in the north, so I just had a question about that. With Canada moving towards implementing these support hubs in the north, and given how hard big Arctic infrastructure is, like the naval port and Nanisivik still not being operational, do you think Canada should try and build a truly permanent year-round base in the Arctic, not just a station, like a full military base? Or should they focus on these smaller hubs and upgraded fields, airfields instead? Is either one better, not even just for like a show of strength, but for manpower and energy and even search and rescue resources? And is it even a feasible idea?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this is batted around a lot. And I'm sure you've heard the calls for Resolute to be a permanent military base. And, I don't know. I think there's a lot of merit to not centralizing all of the assets into one large scale military base or military, facility, which is kind of the approach they're taking now, right? Spreading out to these different hubs and making sure that they can support operations effectively. I think that is the right approach. But again, there's lots of conversations going on around this dual use infrastructure part of it and what exactly that is going to look like. We've seen evidence of what some of it's going to look like in terms of like runway maintenance and improving the runways in places like Inuvik and Rankin Inlet, which I think is really positive. So my fear with that, if we get too caught up in this idea of having one large base, it's not going to serve most of the North, right? North's so big, right? You can superimpose most of Europe into the North, right? All of Europe into the North. So it's a vast place, and that's not going to be particularly helpful. So kind of these hubs and these spokes, it's a really good approach. But I think the question is exactly what resources do we put in those different hubs and spokes? And it's so challenging to operate. I mean, in 2025, Operation Chinook, I kind of saw one of our Chinooks go down, and it took days and days and days to get the parts required to fix that bird and get it back in the sky. So how can we improve the logistics of it, the supply lines of it? To me, that's also a huge question in all this. And are we getting to the point where we should be pre-positioning some of our better or more strategic assets in the north during busier periods? I think we can have that conversation. Is it time perhaps to put one of our search and rescue cormorants maybe in Sinarajak or Iqaluit or Cambridge Bay? I think so. Not on a permanent basis, but on a seasonal basis when things are busy. Why not? So, I love the question. I think we just got to get creative, but no, putting everything in one large scale base, I don't think that is a particularly, wise strategy.
Let's look at how long it took for the Rangers to get new guns, right? Right? Like it took forever. It's embarrassing. It really, really is.
And now they're broken.
And now and they weren't what they wanted to begin with. But let's look at it from that perspective. Like the CAF, our armed forces come up to the Yukon, all to the north all the time, for floods, for fires, for Operation Chinook, for these readiness emergencies, those types of things. And you talk to the soldiers, and they want to be fierce peacekeepers. They don't want to be like filling sandbags because communities are at risk. So let's invest in the Venn diagram that is the Rangers, the community support, our armed forces, and if you do it, it's all about the conduits of communication, right? We need to be able to at any particular time expand past. Well, we have the eyes and the ears of the North, okay, but what happens if the eyes and the ears see or hear something? Right? Then how easily can we mobilize? And there's not going to be trench warfare in the Arctic, but there is going to be situations where we need to see ourselves as having a northern strategy to our Arctic security. So invest in the next obvious steps.
It's actually a pretty good follow-up to that, I think. But how does our current and future defense procurement, such as like the upcoming submarine deal or the recent AOPVs, how does that prepare us to militarily defend ourselves if there is some sort of threat to our sovereignty?
Well, so let's look at the two of those. Those are the two big maritime capabilities pitched as an Arctic security platform. So the Arctic offshore patrol vessels, you've probably seen them in Halifax, right? Big gray hulls. These are the new Polar Class 5. These are a kind of constabulary plus ship. So they've got a small gun on the deck, which is enough to pull over a speeder or a trespasser, but they're not going to engage in combat with any state adversary. But when you're talking about security, the first question is, who are you securing yourself against? And I can tell you, I looked at the documents from the original Harper era plans for armed icebreakers. And the question the Navy asked was, well, what happens if there is a war and there is a Russian icebreaker in the Arctic? And the answer is, well, we'll send a CF-18 up and we'll blow it up. Like, we don't need a battleship. We don't need warships. I mean, we've got power projection by air. So what was built was this kind of general purpose ship geared towards the hybrid threats that Dr. Kikkert was talking about, geared towards illegal fishing, trespassing, environmental protection, pollution, people sailing through without certificates. These are the kinds of hybrid and unconventional threats that we're most likely to face. So that's what those were built to do. Now, if we are at war, God help us, and we're looking at surface vessels from an enemy coming through, you don't need a ship. You've got air power with, long-range anti-ship cruise missiles that can do that job. Now, the submarines are actually not Arctic capable. They're sold as Arctic capable, and every newspaper article you see, they'll like, Arctic submarines. No, they don't do that. They're not nuclear attack submarines. They cannot go under the ice for an extended period of time. The Arctic element is a sales pitch, because people care about Arctic sovereignty, and it's saleable more than North Atlantic sea lanes of communication defense. So whether we go with the South Koreans or the Germans, submarines we get are going to be able to poke their heads under the ice, but they are not Arctic capable. At most, they will sit at the entrances to the Arctic in the west and the east and just watch to see who comes in and out, which is appropriate. That's the way you want to do it.
Autre question? Just trying to see what the... it didn't even translate it incorrectly. Wow. We're doing simultaneous translation. Another one here. My French was too fast, Dr. Grenier.
Kind of to follow up on what you're talking about, the submarines. In April of 24, Trudeau had talked about our North Strong and Free with a $60 billion investment into specifically Arctic conditioned submarines to replace the Victoria class. I was wondering, are those similarly not Arctic? Like they said they would by 2035 they had 12 new submarines.
Same submarines. So we're shopping for a fleet of 12 diesel electric with air independent propulsion submarines. So it's a fancy way of saying non-nuclear. The only submarines in the world that can operate safely for an extended period of time under the ice are nuclear submarines. That's it. It's the way it's always been. Now, what we are purchasing are submarines, like I said, that can kind of poke their heads under the ice. To do anything safely, you've got maybe 2 days under the ice, maybe, but you don't want to go too far because the ice shifts and you can get trapped. So the Royal Canadian Navy will operate these in the Arctic. So Davis Strait, Bering Strait, right at the entrances to the Arctic. And that's really what you want to do. Because if you've got a house, you don't need to guard the whole house. You just guard the door and you can see who's coming in and out. And that's all you really need to do. So those are the submarines we're procuring in the next couple of months. We'll sign a contract probably. But yeah, Arctic, let's call them near Arctic ships.
One here first, Dr. Stan, sorry.
Thank you for fascinating discussion. Just to go back to the potential bases, whether it's more likely as you said, Peter, number of bases. The Canadian military is undermanned or trooped or personnel or whatever the word is, but there aren't as many troops as there needs to be. And I'm wondering, it's a two-pronged question. First, how many troops does one envision one would require to have these bases to protect the Arctic, or at least pay very close attention to it? And B, how do we what incentives do we have to increase the number of troops? Because if you move them from the south, you're going to need to replace those in the south, be it for usual military work or the extra military work that should save, filling sandbags, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and what we do with our armed forces and our military is often, a huge source of discussion, and we have a lot of missions and, stretched pretty thin. There's encouraging signs that perhaps our recruitment is improving and the armed forces are growing again, but there's a lot for them to do. Now, you hear from some pundits that we should be sending every Canadian soldier into the Arctic to get Arctic experience. I think that's a terrible idea. I think that we need to have a cadre of soldiers who can respond quickly and effectively in kind of the worst Arctic conditions. And I think that addresses most of the risks that we see, again, in the near, in the medium term. So I'm looking for small, specialized groups of soldiers like our Arctic response groups or immediate reaction forces that can get boots on the ground quickly and safely. I would much rather see heavy investment into the Rangers, not to grow the number of Rangers. So you'll often see this in the news too. We have to have more Rangers. I think we kind of maxed that out already, right? We definitely are tapping into these communities as much as we can. Let's give them the equipment, the training they need to kind of do the job they can do most effectively. And then again, they do a great job. I also take this moment to highlight, let's not turn the Rangers into something they're not. Let's not break them. Don't try to fix what's not broken. You hear this a lot too. They should be more like the Danish Serious Patrol, right? The Danish Special Forces soldiers that take the dog sleds around Greenland. They're awesome. They do great stuff. I would take 73-year-old Roger Hicklick from Kugluktuk any day over, and I don't know why I'm yelling at you, just because you're the... I'm sorry, but you hear this a lot. The Rangers do a great job at what they do. Let's maximize their potential. So let's train some highly well-trained, well-equipped Canadian Armed Forces from the South who can deploy north quickly, and let's strengthen our Rangers. That'd be my answer to that. I don't know if you have a different perspective.
I would just add, I've seen it so many times where the funding goes back and forth. It's sustainable funding. It's so important. The first thing to go is the junior Rangers programs, right? Like that's the first thing that they cut each time. And that is tragic. I've seen so many rounds of funding where an initiative happens and it creates this hope and space and self-worth, and then it gets pulled out and those families get affected so direly that it sets them back like years from even before. Like it's the pulling out of that funding is so detrimental. You wish that they didn't even start the funding if they're not going to have steady long-term vision on that funding. And that's what I've noticed, Peter. I don't know if you can confer on that or not, but that's usually where the funding leaves, is the junior programs.
Yeah, like when we talk about funding and like where to put our money for our forces, we don't talk about the JCRs a lot, certainly. We also don't talk about like the administrative side of things that makes all this possible, right? My friends who are Rangers, it takes them months to get their paychecks, right? After an exercise or after a patrol. It takes them, they have something called an equipment usage rate, right? Where they're compensated for using their snowmobiles and their Kamatiks and their whatever they're going to use on the land. They get compensated for that. It takes them months to get compensation because the administrative headquarters, and this is for one CRPG in Yellowknife, is so short-staffed. Right? Because we don't focus on kind of the administrative, the logistical side as much as we should. But this is what's really going to improve things. Why are Rangers quitting? Because they're not getting compensated in time, right? So yeah, I think we can solve a lot of problems by focusing on these more under the radar issues, right? That we don't talk about a lot. And the JCR is a good example, right? Let's strengthen that because it's a huge source of intergenerational strength and knowledge sharing. Absolutely.
I'll give you one example of that. So the Yukon Quest, dog racing or dog sledding, not racing, I guess. Yeah, racing. Going into Alaska from Yukon. Who makes that trail, right? Like that trail is created by the Rangers, right? And so they're out there on their sleds and they create this, massive trail that connects Whitehorse all the way into Alaska. And you can imagine if you spend a little bit of time on a sled, those things are expensive, right? And they break down a lot too. It's an expensive sport. I know of people that have worked on that trail that didn't get paid for over a year, right? And it'd be so easy to just go, okay, historically, when the quest comes in, how much? Like look historically at the public accounts, how much money is invested every year, put that money up front. It would be very, very easy to administrate that money.
Yeah, there's a lot of good Ranger stories we could share. That's a great one. I just want to highlight again the training role they play, right? Like, how do we get these soldiers from Toronto, right, who maybe have never been camping before, right? How do we get them Arctic acclimatized? I mean, that is That's a lot of work that's got to go in there. That's why we need the Rangers, right? One of the first things you do as a new recruit from the South who's never been to the North before, you land in -40. You go to Resolute, -45, you're on the land. Like, what they're worried about is you're not going to go to the washroom, right? And so the Rangers are constantly like saying, hey, have you gone to the washroom? Like, maybe you should go. It's been like a week, right? Like, here's these little pink pills you can take. They'll help, right? So it just, again, we have no conception of how hard it is to operate in this space. This is why we need the Rangers so much, right? Yeah.
I have to ask this, yeah? What about the Russians? Because Adam, you said that the Canadian policy was formulated with the Russians as the enemy. But do the Russians want the Canadian Arctic, for God's sake? Because they have their own peace, you know? So you had those Chinese ships moving around. Were there any Russian ships there? How close are the Russians to all this affair that we've heard?
So there's no Russian surface ships. There's submarines, but there's been Russian submarines there since the 50s. So that's not new. But Russian warships do not enter the Canadian Arctic. They never come really anywhere near the Canadian Arctic, maybe Newfoundland, give or take. There's no Russian threat to the Canadian North. This goes back to General Walter Natitchik, who was asked once, well, what would you do if the Russians invaded? And he said, search and rescue. And that's true. I mean, it's glib, but it's true. And I told a Commons committee recently, like, look, that's what NORAD would do. They would sit down with popcorn while the Russians invaded Ellesmere Island, and they'd watch them die as they froze to death. So I mean, there's no realistic Russian threat from a sovereignty perspective. The irony is that the Russians are actually our only allies from a legal perspective on the Northwest Passage. Not from a strategic perspective, but from a legal perspective, because the Russian Arctic has very similar, not identical, but some similar legal dynamics. And the Russians use similar legal rationales to claim their Arctic as we do. So you go back to the 1970s, there's a bit of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours agreement between the Canadians and the Russians about, resisting American pressure, legal pressure in the Arctic. So strategic threat, no. Physical threat, no, not really. But from an information warfare perspective, I think the Russians are quite delighted with what they're seeing.
If I'm not mistaken, the only place our territorial sovereignty in the North was threatened was Hans Island, a dispute island with our Danish friends.
Yes.
And we settled that through a peaceful dispute, and I think we split it down the middle. Was it? Yeah. Without alcohol, yeah.
The Danes got 60%.
Oh, they did? All right. Well, sorry. Older country, I guess. I'm going to use my prerogative as the chair to ask the last question. So yesterday, some of us might have seen scenes of Jean Chrétien and Stephen Harper yucking it up over the Shawinigan handshake at a ceremony. That was a ceremony honoring Stephen Harper for his commitment to Northern development. I think it's fair to say that he devoted, a relatively high attention to the Arctic as Prime Minister. Some of the older folks in the room might remember John Diefenbaker, his Northern Frontier plan. I don't want to date anyone in the room, but that was quite well. So we've seen, attention wax and wane from Southerners, from the federal government to the North. I imagine a number of people in this room are here because of Donald Trump, because of Greenland. That's why I think maybe they're interested in the North. And Donald Trump, whether it's through the next 3 years or the actuarial tables, will not be president forever. So attention by Southerners will wane. But what's the kind of your elevator pitch for why we should have sustained attention as Southerners to the Arctic, particularly to future taxpayers in the room?
Okay, so this kind of summates the point that I'm trying to make as far as no decisions about us without us, and the importance of sophisticated governments in our Indigenous communities. Talking about Harper, for example, right? He was responsible for the road to Tuktoyaktuk, right? So why would a federal government build a road to Tuktoyaktuk? Well, the rationale was, we want to get to our deep water ports and be able to do the thing, right? Of course, we're just doing the thing. So when I had the opportunity to do the C3 mission and go up there, the military attaché, like, we're so excited because we fly into Tuktoyaktuk. They just finished the road, right? Like, so the money was already there, but they're just finishing it, and and that deep water port. So we got into these zodiacs in Tuktoyaktuk after an amazing day. By the way, Tuktoyaktuk is the start of the Trans-Canada Trail, right? That's the very first community of the Trans-Canada Trail. And so those Trans-Canada Trail folks were there as well. It's pretty cool. And so we get into these zodiacs and we steam out at like blistering speed for 2 hours, just hitting weight and it's like, okay, I'm like, where are the ships? Like, I can't even see the icebreaker from here. And they're like, oh, they can't come anywhere near Tuktoyaktuk. The water is really shallow. And it's like, what? And then we get out there, and the helmsman, the captain of the ship, was like, I broke rules coming in this close, actually, right? So that area is like full of the deltas, affluent and stuff. And so there you go. You have a great idea, but it should be North Slope. It shouldn't be Tuktoyaktuk. If you actually ask the folks in the community how to prioritize what we all think is important, which is access to tidewater and access to, so whether it's for fishing vessels or other capabilities in the military complex, it's best if those decisions are made in the North as opposed to in Ottawa.
So why I think this will be sustained, if you go back through Canadian history, we have fits and bursts where we care about Arctic, whether it's security or development or anything. And those fits normally last 5 years, 2, give or take. So we're into year 20-ish right now. So it does seem more sustained. You've got accessibility. Now that accessibility is hard to predict. It's not as accessible as the newspapers make it out to be, but the Arctic is more accessible. And you've got foreign interest. Not so much the Russians, because they've got their own Arctic to worry about, but the Chinese are building one icebreaker a year. So we're working on a couple of polars that we started planning early in the Harper years. The Chinese can build one per year, and they've got 4 now. So right now we've got expanding foreign interest, and potentially down the road, you've got some things that don't exist right now. So fishing dynamics, seabed resource mining, there's all kinds of uncomfortable questions that I see coming down the pike for Canada. Most of them are bad, but from a perspective of maintaining interest, I think it's there.
And your job will be?
Well, I'm tenured.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough.
Dr. Kikkert? Yeah, no, it's a great question. And Adam's right. I mean, the crisis and short response approach has been how we dealt with the Arctic historically, and I would argue, yeah, we have seen more sustained attention, but it's still very much in many circumstances a crisis response kind of reaction. And I think there will be no headway made on some of these resilience factors I mentioned before we have that sustained attention, that sustained funding, and that recognition of the gaps that exist. And I'll just end with a couple of stories. And one, I'll quote one of the rangers I was out there with. He's also the manager of search and rescue in Nunavut, Kelvin Peterson from Kugluktuk. And Kelvin tells a story how from like a response perspective, right? He's seen it that we're all he loves hockey, very passionate, very excited about the Team Canada in the Olympics. And he says, for a long time, we're like a hockey team that never trains. We're a hockey team that never talks to each other. I don't know what my defense is like. I don't know what my goalie is like. I don't know what my forwards are like. I don't know what the bench at all is like, right? We don't know how to work together. We can't do plays together. So, I mean, you talk about operating at the speed of trust. In that kind of setup, it's impossible, right? So in terms of sustained engagement, sustained relationship building to address these safety and security threats, to make sure this team can actually play together well, you need that, right? And the other part is, and I'll end with another story. This one a little, it's from Practitioner-in-Residence, which is, again, Nunavut. That's the community with that water crisis I told you about. So last March, a heating cable, a small little heating cable on a very small section of that pipeline malfunctioned. And so the pipeline froze and it burst. And so the pipeline bringing water from the river, essentially, to the community was done. So everything had to be trucked. And that's like a 5-kilometer journey. It was like a 2-hour round trip. It was blizzarding out, terrible conditions. Those trucks were like 13 years old at this point. You get 10 years usually out of a water truck up north before it's done. So they all broke down. So all of a sudden you have a community of 2,000 that has no access to water, that can't get water to their homes. You have folks who can't do their laundry for months, literally, who can't shower, who have to, only access to water they have is maybe chipping ice or doing water bottles. And we knew this was coming. Like the community government of Prununtuk asked the government of Quebec if it could improve its water infrastructure, if it could buy a new water truck, if it could provide support for this during previous water issues that hit the community in the years before that. The government of Quebec said, well, no, that doesn't constitute an emergency, so we're not going to help you. Well, now they had to help, and now they're responding, and now it's going to cost way more money than had they addressed some of these issues beforehand, right? So there's a lot of gaps in the resilience of these communities. And I think that we've gotten used to them because in the South, we don't think about them very often. And for the politicians who do sometimes think about the North, they've come to rely on the resilience of Northerners. And Northerners are incredibly resilient. Friends in the Rangers are incredibly resilient, but there's limits to everyone's resilience. And the only way people start understanding that, I think, is with that sustained relationship building and trying to understand and empathize in a way that we've not been very good at as governments or as Southerners for a long time. So
wonderful. Okay, that concludes. My colleague, Dr. Linda Harling-Stocker, will have some final announcements. But first, if you could just help me thank Dr. Jim, not Dr. Jim, Mr. Jim Oakner for his tech support, and Dr. Anna Juslag for everything, basically.
So again, please join me in thanking our moderator, Asa, and our panelists, Sandy, Adam, and Pete, for being so enlightening. So it is the Mulroney Institute, so we can fill your social calendar for the next little bit. So the upcoming talks we have on February 26th, we're reconvening our Trump panel. So our folks will be talking about where we are with relationships between Canada and the US, and where things are in the United States. Really uplifting things. On March the 9th, the Honorable Lisa Raitt will be joining us, and she'll be coming to talk about her activist work for dementia and Alzheimer's care. So that'll be coming up around March the 9th. On March the 11th, Senator Roger Kusner will be joining us in continuation of our Sober Second Thought series. So he'll be coming to talk about his role in the Senate. He's fairly new, so he'll give some kind of initial thoughts and reactions to the work that he's been doing there. And the last one I'll leave with you right now is we're currently also organizing tentatively for March 23rd, a panel on Alberta separatism. There will be a little bit more after that, but that's enough to fill you for now. Do watch our social media channels for announcements. We do post on 98.9 XFM is on the community calendar there, as well as through emails and the like. So folks, thank you very much for coming. Safe travels out there. Try not to slip on any ice or fall into any snowbanks or any of that sort of thing. Storm on Monday is kind of going to be diverted from here. It's supposed to stay out in the ocean. So we have a Monday where you actually may have to go to classes, students. I know. Otherwise, again, thanks for coming out and safe travels home.